Before we start our journey into this account, if these stories resonate with you, please consider supporting the channel by subscribing and leaving a like. Your support allows us to continue shedding light on these profound experiences. We would also be delighted to know where our community is tuning in from, so feel free to share your location in the comments. And now our story begins. My name is Sergeant Michael Durant, and for 17 years, I was a member of the Massachusetts State Police. In that time, my work had taken me from the open stretches of highway patrol to the quiet, somber rooms where families grapple with great loss. I had been a witness to the aftermath of moments that would make one's stomach turn, and I had sat across from individuals whose eyes held no hint of remorse. I believed I had seen the full spectrum of human experience, the most difficult trials a person could endure. I was mistaken. What unfolded along Route 3 in Rockland during the winter of 1991 was not about humanity's worst nature. It was something else entirely. Something that existed in the quiet spaces between understanding and the unknown. It began on February 14th, a Valentine's Day that I remember with a clarity that has never faded. My wife, Karen, had made plans for us. She reserved a table at that cozy Italian place in Quincy she adored, and I had given her my word that I would be home by 6 o'clock. After nearly 2 decades in my profession, I should have known better than to make a promise when working a late shift, a time when the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. The call arrived at around 4:30 in the afternoon, just as the winter sun began its descent toward the horizon. The sky was a masterpiece of cold, soft colors, painting the snow-covered landscape in gentle shades of orange and purple. It was a beautiful, peaceful scene, a stark contrast to the voice that soon crackled through my radio. The dispatcher's tone was routine, yet it cut through the quiet of my patrol car. "Trooper Durant," she said, "we've received a report of an unattended vehicle on Route 3 southbound at mile marker 42, just past the Rockland exit. The vehicle has reportedly been there for approximately 3 hours. There's no sign of the driver. Can you respond?" At that moment, I was already on Route 3, heading north toward the barracks in Norwell, my shift winding down. Mile marker 42 was only a 10-minute drive south of my position. With a sense of duty that was as ingrained as breathing, I activated my lights and found a safe place to execute a U-turn across the wide, snow-dusted median. "Roger that, dispatch," I responded, my voice calm. "On my way to mile marker 42. Do we have a description of the vehicle?" The information came back quickly. A blue 1987 Honda Accord, Massachusetts plates. Registration comes back to a Sandra Whitmore, age 34, with an address in Brockton. No outstanding issues on record. Unattended vehicles were not an uncommon sight on Route 3, particularly in the depths of winter. The highway serves as a vital artery for the South Shore, a long stretch of pavement connecting the bustling heart of Boston to the quiet retreat of Cape Cod. It was a road known for testing the limits of machinery and the patience of drivers, especially when the weather turned harsh. But something about this particular call felt different. A subtle note of disharmony in the day's otherwise placid rhythm. 3 hours was a significant amount of time for a car to sit alone. The weather had been clear and cold all day, with no storm to explain why someone might walk away from their car, and no obvious mechanical reason for a sudden breakdown. A feeling of unease began to settle over me, a quiet intuition honed by years of observation. I arrived to find the Honda exactly where dispatch had indicated, resting on the shoulder of the road as if it had been gently placed there. Its hazard lights were still blinking, a steady, rhythmic warning that pulsed in the growing dusk. The car was covered in a delicate layer of frost, and a fine dusting of snow had started to accumulate on its roof and hood, a testament to the time it had sat there, silent and still. I pulled my cruiser up behind it, the blue and red lights casting long, dancing shadows across the snow. I ran the license plate again myself, a habit of confirming every detail, and the information matched what dispatch had provided. Taking my flashlight, I stepped out into the biting cold air. The temperature had fallen below 20 degrees, and my breath billowed out in thick, white clouds that dissolved into the twilight. As I approached the blue Honda, the sense of disquiet grew stronger. The air was still, heavy with the sharp cold of a winter evening setting in. I shined my flashlight on the vehicle, the beam of light cutting through the deepening shadows and illuminating a scene that was both ordinary and deeply unsettling. The car's doors were all locked, a detail I confirmed by gently trying each handle. I peered through the driver's side window, my flashlight beam sweeping across the interior. What I saw only added to the growing puzzle. The car was tidy, almost obsessively so. There was no trash on the floor, no personal items scattered on the seats, none of the usual clutter of daily life. It looked as though it had been carefully prepared for a journey, not abandoned in the middle of one. Then my light fell upon the steering column, and I saw it. The keys were still in the ignition. That small detail sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the falling temperature. A familiar, cold not formed in the pit of my stomach, a silent alarm that experience had taught me never to ignore. People do not walk away from their car and leave the keys behind, not unless something urgent pulled them away, or something truly frightening compelled them to flee without a second thought. I completed a slow walk around the vehicle, my boots crunching on the frozen ground. I examined the doors again, the windows, the body of the car, searching for any sign of a struggle or forced entry. But there was nothing. The car was pristine, untouched. My attention then turned to the ground surrounding the vehicle. The snow on the shoulder was disturbed. Footprints. They led away from the driver's side door, a single set of tracks pressed clearly into the fresh powder. I followed them with my flashlight beam, my heart beating a little faster. The prints headed down the gentle slope of the embankment, away from the relative safety of the road, and toward the dark, imposing tree line. And then they disappeared into the deep woods. I keyed my radio, my voice steady despite the unease I felt. "Dispatch, this is Trooper Durant. I'm at the scene. The vehicle is locked, with the keys in the ignition. There are no immediate signs of foul play. I have a set of footprints leading from the car into the woods off the shoulder. It appears to be a single person, possibly female, based on the size of the shoe prints. I'm going to follow the tracks into the tree line to see where they lead." The dispatcher's voice came back, professional but with a hint of concern. "Copy that, Trooper Durant. Be advised, the temperature is dropping quickly. We're expecting another cold front to move through after dark." I acknowledged her warning and began to make my way down the embankment, the frozen snow crunching loudly under my heavy boots. At first, the footprints were clear and easy to follow, a distinct path leading into the wilderness. But as I entered the dense pine forest, the trail became more sporadic, harder to track. The trees here were thick, their branches interwoven to form a dense canopy that blocked out what little remained of the daylight. My flashlight became my only source of illumination, its beam creating a small, moving circle of light in a vast sea of darkness. The shadows it cast danced and shifted between the tree trunks, playing tricks on my eyes. I had followed the tracks for perhaps 50 yards, moving deeper into profound silence of forest, when they suddenly stopped. It was not a gradual stop, not as if the person had hesitated, turned around, or changed direction. The footprints just ended. They terminated abruptly in the middle of a small, snow-covered clearing, as if the person who made them had simply been lifted from the earth. I stood there for a long moment, slowly rotating in a full circle, my flashlight beam sweeping across the empty space and the surrounding trees. There was nothing. No continuation of the tracks, no sign of a struggle, no indication of where Sandra Whitmore had gone. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The wind had begun to pick up, a low moan that rustled through the pine needles and made the ancient trees creak and groan around me. Somewhere in the distance, a heavy, snow-laden branch snapped to a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot in the stillness, making me jump. A state trooper with 17 years of experience was jumping at the sound of falling branches. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I needed to get a grip. "Dispatch!" I said into my radio, my voice tighter than before. "I've lost the trail. The footprints terminate in a clearing approximately 50 yards from the vehicle. There is no sign of the subject. I am going to expand my search of the immediate area." "Copy that," the dispatcher replied. "Be careful out there, Mike." Hearing her use my first name instead of my rank told me she was worried. That made two of us. The mystery of this place was deepening with every passing minute, wrapping around me like the cold, dark woods themselves. I began my descent into the tree line, a solitary figure moving against the encroaching night. The transition from the open road to the forest was stark, like stepping across a threshold into a different world entirely. The sounds of the highway, already distant, seemed to be swallowed up by the dense wall of pines, replaced by a profound and heavy silence. My boots sank into the snow, which was deeper here, untouched by the plows or the warmth of the sun. Each step was a labor, a rhythmic crunching sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet woods. The air grew colder with every yard I traveled, a biting chill that found its way through the layers of my uniform, settling deep in my bones. It was a kind of cold that felt ancient, as if it had lived among these trees long before the road was built, waiting for someone to venture close enough to feel its touch. The footprints I was following were distinct at first, deep impressions in the white blanket that marked a clear path forward. I kept my flashlight trained on them, the beam cutting a narrow tunnel of visibility through the gloom. The trees pressing close on either side, their branches heavy with snow, bowing low like silent observers bowing in reverence to the winter. I felt a strange sense of trespass, the distinct feeling that I was an unwelcome guest in a house that had been closed up for the season. The tracks wove between the trunks, not in a panicked dash, but with a steady, purposeful stride. There was no sign of stumbling, no erratic changes in direction that would suggest confusion or fear. Whoever had walked this path had done so with intention, moving deeper into the darkness with resolve that I could not understand. As I moved further from the road, the forest floor became uneven, hidden roots and fallen limbs creating obstacles beneath the snow. The footprints began to space out, becoming more sporadic as the terrain grew rougher. I had to slow my pace, sweeping my light back and forth to keep the trail in view. The darkness was nearly absolute now, the canopy overhead blocking out the moon and stars, leaving me in a world of shadows and gray shapes. My breath hung in the air before me, a momentary fog that vanished as quickly as it appeared. I found myself listening intently, straining to hear any sound of movement ahead, anything that would tell me I was closing in on Sandra Whitmore. But the only sound was the wind, a low, mournful sigh that moved through the upper branches of pines, causing to sway and creak in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. I had followed the trail for what felt like a significant distance, perhaps 50 yards or more, when I entered a small clearing. The trees here had pulled back, creating a circular opening in the forest that was filled with a pale, ambient light from the sky above. I stopped, swinging my flashlight beam across the snow, expecting to see the tracks continuing on the other side. But they did not. The footprints led into the center of the clearing, and then, quite simply, they ceased. I stared at the ground, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. There were no return tracks, no signs of a scuffle, no disturbance in the pristine snow that would suggest a fall or a leap. The trail just ended, as abruptly as a sentence cut short. It was as if the person walking had been lifted straight up into the air, vanishing without a trace. I stood in the center of that clearing, slowly turning in a circle, shining my light into the wall of trees that surrounded me. The shadows stretched and twisted, playing tricks on my tired eyes. I felt a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline, a primal reaction to the impossible nature of what lay before me. The silence of the clearing felt expectant, heavy with a presence I could not name. Somewhere to my right, deep in the woods, a branch snapped with a loud, dry crack. The sound was explosive in the quiet, and I spun toward it, my hand instinctively going to my belt, though there was nothing there to confront. It was just the woods settling in for the night, the cold causing the wood contract, but my heart hammered against my ribs all the same. I took a moment to compose myself, forcing my breathing to slow. I was a professional, trained to deal with facts and evidence. But here, the evidence defied logic. I keyed my radio. The static hiss accompanying tethered to the reality I had left behind on the road. "Dispatch. I have lost a trail," I said, my voice sounding small in the vastness of the woods. The footprints terminate in a clearing approximately 50 yards from the vehicle. There is no sign of the subject. I am going to expand my search pattern. The response came back quickly, the dispatcher's voice warm and familiar. "Copy that. Be careful out there, Mike." Her use of my first name was a breach of protocol, a small gesture of humanity that told me she sensed the strangeness of the situation too. I clipped the radio back to my belt and looked around the clearing one last time. The snow was smooth and unbroken beyond the final footprint. I was alone in the dark, chasing a ghost. I spent the next 20 minutes moving in widening circles around the spot where the tracks had vanished. I moved methodically, fighting the urge to rush, forcing myself to skin every shadow and every snowbank. The temperature continued its steady decline, the cold becoming a physical weight that pressed against me. My fingers, even inside my gloves, were beginning to grow numb, and the tip of my nose stung with the frost. The woods seemed to stretch on endlessly in every direction, a labyrinth of pine and snow that looked exactly the same no matter which way I turned. I was beginning to consider calling off the search, to request additional units and wait for daylight when visibility would be on our side. It felt futile to be stumbling around in the dark, risking injury for a trail that had already gone cold. I was about to turn back toward the highway when I saw it. To my left, through a gap in the trees, something caught the beam of my flashlight. It was a dull reflection, not quite natural, a glint of metal that stood out against the matte textures of bark and snow. I paused, squinting into the darkness. It looked like a shape large and geometric, sitting in another clearing about 30 yards away. The moon had risen higher now, casting a faint, silvery glow through the breaks in the canopy, and as I moved closer, the object resolved itself. It was a car, another vehicle, sitting alone and silent in the middle of the woods, far from any road or trail that could have brought it there. I approached it with caution, my senses on high alert. It was a red Ford Taurus, an older model, perhaps from the mid-'80s. The car sat low on its suspension, looking heavy and immovable. Unlike the Honda on the highway, this vehicle did not look like it had just arrived. It was covered in a thick layer of pine needles, twigs, and forest debris, the detritus of the woods having claimed it as its own. It looked as though it had been sitting there for a long time, slowly becoming part of the landscape. And yet, as I got closer, I noticed a detail that made me pause. The layer of snow on the roof and hood was relatively fresh, matching the accumulation on the ground. It was untouched, pristine. It was a contradiction. A car that looked ancient and abandoned, yet sat under a blanket of snow that was only a few days old. I reached the driver's side and shone my light through the window. The glass was grimy, coated with a film of dust and pollen, but I could see inside. The interior smelled musty, even to the closed door, that distinct, stale odor of confined space that has not been opened in seasons. The seats were empty. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, the door groaned open. The hinges protested with sound of rusted metal grinding together. I swept my light across the seats. There was no one inside. The upholstery was faded. The dashboard cracked from exposure to temperature shifts. But on the passenger seat, sitting upright as it placed there moments ago, was a woman's purse. I reached in and picked it up carefully, using a pen from my pocket to hook the strap, preserving any potential evidence. It was a standard leather handbag, worn at the edges. I opened it and found a wallet inside. The driver's license looked up at me from behind a plastic window. The face of a woman with a kind smile and styled hair. The name read Margaret Higgle, age 41, with an address in Quincy. I checked the issue date on the license, 1989. I stared at the date, doing the mental math, trying to place it in the timeline of the present day. I keyed my radio again. Trooper Durant to dispatch. I said, I have located another vehicle, a red Ford Taurus. It appears to have been here for a significant amount of time, though the snow cover is fresh. I have found a purse with identification. I am going to run the plates now. I read the license plate number into the radio and waited, standing there in the cold, the silence of the woods pressing in on me. I looked at the car again, trying to imagine how it had navigated through the dense trees to arrive at the spot. There were no tracks leading to it, no broken saplings or crushed undergrowth that would indicate a path. It was as if it had been dropped from the sky. The dispatcher's voice returned, and this time the tone was different. It was sharp, laced with confusion and alarm. Trooper Durant, be advised. That vehicle was reported stolen in January of 1990. The owner, Margaret Higgle, was reported missing on the same day. That was over a year ago. The words hung in the air between us. January 1990. I looked at the car, then back at the dark woods surrounding me. This vehicle had been sitting here for over a year, and the woman who owned it had been missing for just as long. I was standing less than 100 yards from where Sandra Whitmore had seemingly vanished just hours ago, looking at the car of a woman who had vanished a year prior. A cold realization washed over me, deeper and more penetrating than the winter air. This was not a coincidence. 2 women, 2 cars, 1 location. I felt a sudden, overwhelming need for backup, for another human voice, for lights and noise to push back the encroaching dark. Dispatch, I said, my voice steady but urgent. I need additional units at my location immediately. I need someone to secure the vehicle on the highway, and I need help searching these woods. We may have a situation here that is larger than a single missing person. Copy that, Durant, the dispatcher replied. Units are en route. Sit tight. I backed away from the Taurus, suddenly very aware of how alone I was. The woods felt different now. They were no longer just a passive landscape. They felt watchful, hiding secrets that had been buried for years, secrets that were just now beginning to surface in the cold light of the moon. I backed away from the red Ford Taurus, moving slowly until the trees offered a semblance of cover, though I was not sure what I was hiding from. The discovery of Margaret Higgle's vehicle, sitting silent and hidden for over a year, had shifted the ground beneath my feet. This was no longer a routine search for a stranded motorist. It had become something far more complex and unsettling. I stood in the darkness, the cold air biting at my exposed skin, and felt a profound sense of isolation wash over me. The forest seemed to press in closer, the shadows between the pine trunks deepening as if they were alive. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, harsh and rapid in the frigid air, a rhythm of life in a place that felt devoid of it. Somewhere in the distance, the wind moved through the upper branches, causing them to creak and crack with the sound of ancient wood straining against the winter. I knew I should wait for backup. That is what the training dictates. That is a logical, safe choice when the parameters of a situation change so drastically. But as I stood there, my mind kept drifting to Sandra Whitmore and to Margaret Higgle, and to the unsettling possibility of others who might be out here in the cold. If there was even the slightest chance that someone was still alive, lost in this freezing labyrinth and in need of help, I could not simply stand still and wait for others to arrive. It was then, in the midst of that heavy silence, that I heard it. It was a sound that did not belong in a frozen forest, a sound so out of place that it took my mind a moment to categorize it. It was the sound of a radio, or rather, the static of a radio, that distinctive, hissing white noise that fills the empty spaces between stations. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but it was undeniably there, and it was coming from deeper in the woods, from a place beyond where I stood. I turned my head, trying to pinpoint the source. It was a steady, rhythmic hiss, unnatural and persistent. The rational part of my mind told me to hold my position, to let the additional units arrive and secure the scene. But a deeper instinct, a pull I could not explain, urged me forward. I began to walk toward the sound. The static grew gradually louder as I moved, acting as a twisted sort of beacon guiding me through the trees. My flashlight beam swept back and forth, cutting through the darkness, illuminating the rough bark of pine trunks and the pristine, snow-covered undergrowth. There was no sign of people, no tracks to follow this time, only the sound. It felt as though the forest itself was generating the noise, a static charge building in the air. The walk was difficult. The ground was uneven, hidden beneath the snow, and I had to step carefully to avoid twisting an ankle on the roots and rocks that lay concealed. Every step took me further from the known world of the highway and deeper into a realm of shadows and cold. After about 10 minutes of walking, the terrain began to change. The ground sloped downward, and the trees grew more sparse, replaced by large, granite boulders that jutted out of the earth like the bones of the mountain. The sound of the static was louder here, echoing off the rock walls of a small ravine that opened up before me. It was a hollow, desolate place, a tear in the earth that had been forgotten by time. I stood at the edge, looking down into the darkness. The beam of my light could not reach the bottom, swallowed by the gloom. I knew I had to go down. The sound was coming from below, a persistent invitation that I could not refuse. I started to make my way down the slope, moving sideways to maintain my balance. I used my free hand to steady myself against the rough bark of the trees and the cold, slick surfaces of the boulders. The descent was treacherous, a slow and careful negotiation with gravity. The cold seemed to intensify as I descended, pooling in the ravine like water. I was halfway down, my focus entirely on my footing, when the ground beneath me betrayed me. My foot found purchase on a rock that looked solid, but it was covered in a thin, treacherous layer of clear ice. In an instant my boot slipped, and I lost my footing. I went down heavily, sliding uncontrollably down the rest of the slope. The world became a blur of snow, rock, and darkness as I tumbled toward the bottom. My flashlight flew from my hand, spinning away into the dark, and I heard it clatter loudly against the stones before the light winked out, leaving me in sudden, absolute blackness. I came to a stop at the bottom of the ravine, lying in the snow, breathless and disoriented. For a long moment, I simply lay there, staring up at the faint patch of night sky visible through the trees far above. I took a moment to assess my body. My shoulder ached with a dull throb where I had impacted the ground. I could feel the biting wetness of the snow soaking through my uniform pants, chilling my skin. But as I lay there, trying to catch my breath, I realized something that made my blood run colder than the snow around me. The static had stopped. The forest was completely, oppressively silent. It was not the normal quiet hush of a winter night, where the wind still whispers and the trees still settle. This was an absolute silence, a vacuum of sound. No wind, no creaking wood, no distant hum of traffic. Just nothing. It felt as though the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. I fumbled at my belt with numb, trembling fingers, searching for my backup flashlight. It was a smaller unit, one I kept for emergencies, and right now, it felt like my only lifeline. My hands were clumsy with the cold, but I finally managed to unclip it and twist the bezel. A beam of light, weaker and more yellow than my main light, cut through the dark. It was not much, but it was enough to see my immediate surroundings. I was at the bottom of a narrow ravine, surrounded by large, looming boulders that were covered in ice and patches of dark green moss. The walls of the ravine rose up about 15 feet on either side of me, creating a sense of being trapped in a stone cage. I swept the light around, the beam shaking slightly in my grip, and there, directly in front of me, wedged tightly between two massive boulders, was something that defied all logic. It was a car, another vehicle, hidden in the depths of the earth. This one was a green Buick, an early 80s model, its paint dull and scratched. The front end was crumpled inward, metal folded like paper, evidence of a significant impact that had occurred long ago. But it wasn't the crash damage that caused my heart to hammer against my ribs. It was the interior. The car's radio was on. The dial glowed with a faint, amber light in the darkness, a ghostly illumination in the dead vehicle. As I watched, paralyzed by the sight, the static started again. It began softly, a whisper sound, and then gradually built in volume. But there was something wrong with it. It wasn't just random white noise anymore. There was a rhythm to it, a rising and falling cadence that sounded disturbingly like breathing. In and out, in and out. I approached the Buick slowly, my feet heavy as lead. I did not want to look inside, but I had to. I shone my light through the shattered driver's side window. There was someone in the driver's seat. A woman was slumped over the steering wheel, her head resting on her arms as if she were sleeping. I reached through a broken window, my hand shaking uncontrollably, and touched her shoulder to check for a pulse, though deep down I already knew what I would find. Her skin was ice cold, solid and unyielding. She had been gone for a long time. Suddenly, the static from the radio changed pitch, becoming a high, piercing whine that vibrated in my teeth. I jerked my hand back, stumbling away from the car. That was when I noticed the dashboard fully. Every single light was illuminated. The hazard indicators, the high beam symbol, the radio display, all glowing with an impossible energy. The battery of this car should have been dead years ago. There was no scientific reason for it to have power. The whine from the radio abruptly cut out, replaced by a voice. It was female, distorted and distant, sounding as if it were traveling from a great distance or from deep underwater. Route 3, mile marker 42, the voice said, "They're waiting." Then the radio went silent again, leaving only the amber glow of the dial staring back at me in the dark. The silence that followed the voice was heavier than before, a tangible weight that pressed against my eardrums. My mind struggled to process what I had just heard. "They're waiting." The words echoed in my head, looping over and over, each repetition bringing a fresh wave of cold dread. I stared at the amber light of the radio dial, the only source of warmth in a frozen world, and felt a profound sense of dislocation. It was as if the laws of physics, the reliable rules of cause and effect that govern my daily life, had been suspended in this ravine. A car battery dead for years could not power a radio. A radio could not speak with a voice that sounded so impossibly distant. And yet, here I was witnessing it. My own radio crackled suddenly, the sharp burst of static making me jump so violently I nearly dropped my flashlight again. "Trooper Durant," the dispatcher's voice cut through the air, sounding tinny and far away, but reassuringly human. "Backup is arriving at your location on the highway. What is your 20? I tried to respond, but my throat was constricted, dry and tight. I swallowed hard, forcing moisture back into my mouth, and tried again. I'm in a ravine," I croaked, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. I cleared my throat and spoke with more authority, though my hand still trembled. "Approximately a quarter mile into the woods from a highway. I have found another vehicle with a deceased occupant. I need forensics and a recovery team down here immediately." "Copy that," came the reply. "Can you make it back to the highway?" I looked at the steep, snowy slope I had tumbled down, then back at the green Buick and its silent passenger. "Yeah," I said, breathless. "Yeah, I'm heading back now." I took one last look at the car. The lights on the dashboard were still glowing, a silent vigil in the dark. I turned my back on it, feeling a primal urge to run, to scramble up the slope and put as much distance as possible between myself and that impossible machine. The climb out of the ravine was difficult. My boots slipped on the icy rocks, and my breath came in ragged gasps. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a footstep. It took me nearly 30 minutes to navigate my way back through the dense forest. I must have gotten turned around in the dark, my internal compass skewed by the fall and the fear, because I emerged from the tree line about 100 yards south of where I had entered. The sight of the highway was a relief that nearly brought me to my knees. 2 state police cruisers were parked behind Sandra Whitmore's Honda. their light bars spinning, painting the snow and the trees in alternating washes of blue and red. The modern, mechanical rhythm of the lights felt incredibly grounding after the stillness of the woods. My partner, Trooper Lisa Hygel, was standing by the lead cruiser, scanning the tree line. When she saw me emerge, she hurried over, her face etched with concern. "Jesus, Mike," she said, her voice low. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I leaned against the hood of her cruiser, the heat from the engine seeping through my uniform, warming my frozen side. "I found 3 more cars in there," I told her, my voice flat. 3 more abandoned vehicles. One of them has a body. Her expression shifted instantly from concern to professional seriousness. "Show me," she said. I shook my head, the memory of the ravine still too fresh. "It's not safe," I said. "We need to wait for daylight. We need to bring in a proper search team with better equipment. The terrain is treacherous." "What do you mean it's not safe?" she asked, probing. "What else did you find?" I looked back at the dark wall of the forest. It looked different to me now. It wasn't just trees and snow. It was a veil hiding something malevolent. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but something's not right out there. The car, the radio was working, Lisa. It shouldn't have been, but it was." She looked at me, searching my face for signs of shock or injury. We secured the scene, I continued, and waited for forensics team to arrive. While we waited in the warmth of the cruisers, I ran the plates on the Buick I'd found in the ravine. The system returned the information in seconds, confirming the impossible timeline. The vehicle belonged to Patricia Morrison, age 38. She had been reported missing in 1987, for years ago. Last seen leaving her job at a hospital in Brockton. She had simply never made a home. "For years," Lisa said quietly, staring at the computer screen. "She's been sitting in that ravine for 4 years, and nobody found her." "These woods are deep," I said, trying to rationalize it. "And that ravine is hidden. If you didn't know it was there, if you weren't looking for it, you'd never find it." "What about the radio?" she asked again. "You said it was still working." I nodded, feeling the weight of the memory. "All the lights were on," I said, "and I heard a voice." "What kind of voice?" I hesitated. It sounded crazy, even to me. "A woman's voice," I said softly. She said something about Route 3 and mile marker 42. She said, "They're waiting." Lisa looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or doubt. "Mike," she said gently, "you've been out in the cold for over an hour. Hypothermia can do strange things to the senses." "I know what I heard," I said, more sharply than I intended. "And I know what I saw. That radio shouldn't have been working, but was." The forensics team arrived around 8 o'clock that evening, a convoy of vans and specialized trucks that turned the roadside into a hive of activity. Additional troopers were called in to help with the search, their flashlights creating a web of beams that cut through the night. I led the team back into the woods, this time taking a more direct route that avoided the steep drop where I had fallen. We found the green Buick exactly where I had left it, still wedged between the boulders at the bottom of the ravine. But the scene had changed. The car was dark now. No lights on the dashboard, no amber glow from the radio dial, no static. The battery, when tested by the technicians, was completely dead, frozen solid, and devoid of any charge, as expected for a vehicle that had sat through 4 New England winters. The medical examiner, a man who had seen everything the job had to offer, confirmed that the woman in the driver's seat was indeed Patricia Morrison. Based on the state of the remains and the environment, she had been dead for approximately 4 years, consistent with the date she had gone missing. The initial assessment suggested the cause of death was blunt force trauma from the crash, though a full autopsy would be needed to be certain. "Strange place to crash," the examiner remarked, looking up at the steep walls of the ravine. "This is pretty far from the highway. How did she end up down here?" That was the question that hung over all of us. The ravine was at least a quarter mile from Route 3, through dense, unyielding forest. There were no old logging roads, no trails, nothing that would explain how Sedan had navigated trees to end up wedged between boulders in the middle of nowhere. We spent the next several hours searching the area, expanding the perimeter with every hour that passed. The teams located the red Ford Taurus I had discovered earlier, documenting it and beginning the process of recovery. And then, just before midnight, the radio crackled with another discovery. They had found something else. 2 more vehicles, both hidden in different parts of forest, camouflaged by the years and the elements. One was a pickup truck, a 1988 model, almost buried under a drift of snow. The other was a minivan from 1985, its windows covered in moss. We ran the registrations immediately. Both vehicles were registered to people who had been reported missing in the years they were last seen. Both had been there for years, unnoticed by the world passing by on the highway nearby. 5 vehicles, 5 missing people, all of them located along the same short stretch of Route 3. All of them found within a quarter-mile radius of mile marker 42. And one of those people, Sandra Whitmore, had vanished just hours ago, leaving her car running on the shoulder. We never found Sandra Whitmore that night. Despite the dogs, the lights, and the manpower, the woods kept her hidden. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the search was called off. The cold had become dangerous for the search teams, and the darkness made the terrain too treacherous to navigate safely. We would resume at first light with additional resources, including a helicopter with thermal imaging capabilities. I drove back to the barracks in Norwell as the sun was just starting to hint at rising, the sky turning a bruised shade of gray. I was exhausted, my body aching from the fall and the cold, but my mind was racing, deeply unsettled by what we had uncovered. I went home to a quiet house. Karen was already up when I walked through the door. She took one look at me and didn't say a word about the missed dinner reservation or the late hour. She just made me a cup of strong coffee and sat with me at the kitchen table while I tried to process what I had seen. "You should get some sleep," she said finally, her hand resting on mine. "You look exhausted." "I keep thinking about those cars," I said, staring into the black liquid in my mug. "Why there? What is in those woods that would make 5 different people abandon their vehicles and walk into the forest?" "Maybe they weren't abandoned," Karen suggested quietly. "Maybe they were taken." It was a thought that had been nagging at the back of my mind all night, a dark whisper I hadn't wanted to voice. The idea of someone or something luring people off Route 3, leading them into the woods, was too disturbing to contemplate. I managed a few hours of fitful sleep, my dreams filled with static and snow, before my phone rang at 10 o'clock in the morning. It was Lieutenant Morrison, my commanding officer. "Mike," he said, his voice grim, "we got another one." I was instantly awake, the fog of sleep vanishing. "Another vehicle?" "Another abandoned vehicle," he confirmed. "Route 3 southbound. Mile marker 43. A woman called in about 20 minutes ago. Said she was driving past and saw a car sitting on the shoulder with the door open and nobody around. Mile marker 43. Less than a mile from where we'd found Sandra Whitmore's Honda yesterday. The pattern was continuing. "I'm on my way," I said, ending the call with Lieutenant Morrison. The drive back to Route 3 was a blur of gray asphalt and white snowdrifts, my mind racing faster than the engine. The new scene at mile marker 43 was eerily similar to the one from the day before, yet held its own distinct, unsettling details. The vehicle was a silver 1990 Toyota Camry, like Sandra Whitmore's Honda. The driver's side door stood wide open, a gaping mouth inviting the winter chill into the cabin. The car was empty, devoid of life. However, unlike the silent mystery of the previous day, this time we had a witness. The woman who had called it in, Jessica Porter, was still there, sitting in her own car with a state trooper taking her statement. She was visibly shaken, clutching a cup of coffee as if it were a lifeline. I approached gently, introducing myself. "I saw her," Jessica kept repeating, her voice trembling. "I saw the woman. She was standing right there by the car, and then she just walked into the woods. I knelt to be at eye level with her. Can you describe her? I asked. Jessica took a shuddering breath. Blonde hair, maybe 30 years old. She was wearing a blue coat and jeans. She was just standing there by the car, looking at the woods. I slowed down. I was going to ask if she needed help, but before I could stop, she started walking, just straight into the trees, like she was following something. Did you see what she was following? I pressed gently. Jessica shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. Nothing. There was nothing there, but she walked into those woods like she was being led. We searched the woods around mile marker 43 for hours, retracing the familiar, grim steps of the day before. We found the woman's footprints in the snow, mirroring the path of Sandra Whitmore. And, just like before, they ended abruptly in a clearing with no indication of where she had gone. We identified the missing woman as Rebecca Torres, a 32-year-old accountant from Weymouth. According to her husband, she had been on her way to work, calling him at 7:45 a.m. to report heavy traffic. That was the last voice he heard. 2 women in less than 24 hours. The same stretch of highway, the same inexplicable behavior, walking into the woods and vanishing. Lieutenant Morrison pulled me aside as the sun began to dip low, casting long shadows across the snow. The search teams were packing up, defeated by the coming night. Mike, he said, his tone serious, I'm bringing in the FBI. This is beyond our scope now. I nodded in agreement. It was a logical, necessary step, but I felt a strange pang of possessiveness. These were my woods, my highway, my missing people. I felt a responsibility to them. There's something else, Morrison continued. We pulled the records for this section of Route 3, going back 20 years. Missing persons reports, abandoned vehicles. Anything unusual. He handed me a thick file. There's a pattern. I opened the file and stared at the printout of cases. It was a timeline of loss. Every year in February, reports of abandoned vehicles and missing people clustered around a specific stretch of highway. Sometimes it was a single individual, sometimes more, but it always happened in February, and it always centered around mile marker 42. 20 years of disappearances, I murmured, all within a 1-mile radius of the same spot. How had nobody noticed this before? Morrison sighed, looking out at the tree line. The cases are spread out over 2 decades. Different troopers, different jurisdictions, different investigators. Nobody connected the dots until now. But look at this. He pointed to a note at the bottom of the page. In 1971, there was a major accident at mile marker 42. A school bus went off the road during a severe snowstorm. 17 children died. The quarries, the memories surfaced instantly. I had grown up hearing stories about the old quarries near Rockland. They had been closed in the 1960s after a series of accidents, filled with water and fenced off, forbidden places of deep, dark water. The school bus had crashed into one of them, breaking through the winter ice. They had recovered most of the bodies, a tragedy that scarred the community, but some had never been found, lost in the depths. You think this is connected to the bus accident? I asked. Morrison shrugged, a gesture of helplessness. I think there's something about this place that's wrong. Whether it's the quarries, the accident, or something else entirely, I don't know. But people keep disappearing here, Mike, and they keep disappearing in February. That night, sleep was impossible. I sat at my kitchen table at 3 a.m., surrounded by maps and printouts, the ghosts of 17 children and dozens of missing adults filling the room. Karen found me there. Mike, you need to rest, she said softly. I'm missing something. I told her, frustration leaking into my voice. There's a connection I'm not seeing. Why February? Why that exact spot? She looked at the paper spread out before me. What if it's not about the location? She suggested. What if it's about the date? I looked at her. You said the bus accident happened in 1971, when in February. I shuffled to the papers until I found the accident report. February 14th, 1971. Valentine's Day. The same day Sandra Whitmore had disappeared exactly 20 years later. I checked the other cases. Every disappearance, every abandoned vehicle over the past 20 years. They had all occurred within a week of February 14th. It was all happening around the anniversary. The FBI arrived the next morning, bringing a new energy to the investigation. Special Agent Caroline Wright was a woman in her late 30s with sharp, observant eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that commanded respect. She brought with her a team of 6 agents and equipment that I didn't recognize, setting up a command post in the Rockland Police Station with efficient precision. They immediately began re-interviewing witnesses and reviewing every scrap of evidence we had collected. Sergeant Durant, Agent Wright said after she had reviewed my reports, "I need you to take me to quarry." "The old Union Street quarry?" I asked. "It's been sealed off for decades." "I know," she replied, "but according to historical records, that's where the bus went in. And according to your map, it's also roughly in the center of where all these vehicles have been found." She was right. When I plotted the locations of the abandoned cars on a map, they formed a rough circle about half a mile in diameter. And sitting directly at the center of that circle was the old quarry. We drove out to the site that afternoon. The quarry was surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, with faded warning signs posted every 20 feet. Danger, deep water, and no trespassing. But the fence had gaps, places where time and weather had worn to the metal, and where people had clearly forced their way in. Agent Wright produced a pair of bolt cutters from her vehicle and made short work of the padlock on the main gate. We walked down the old access road, our boots crunching on gravel and broken asphalt, relics of an industrial past. The quarry opened up before us, a vast, silent pit filled with dark, still water. The walls were sheer granite, dropping straight down for at least 60 feet before hitting the water surface. God only knew how deep the water itself went. "This is where they recovered the bodies?" Wright asked, her voice hushed by the scale of the place. "Some of them," I answered. 17 children died when the bus crashed through the ice. They recovered 14 bodies. 3 were never found. Wright walked to the very edge of the quarry, looking down at the water. It was completely opaque, its surface like black glass, reflecting the gray sky above. "Have there been any other incidents here since the bus accident?" she asked. "A few drownings over the years," I said. "Mostly teenagers sneaking in to swim. The last one was in 1987. That's when they finally upgraded the fencing. But as you can see, it hasn't done much good." "I want to bring in divers," Wright said decisively. "I want to know what's at the bottom of this quarry." "In this weather?" I asked, skeptical. "The water temperature is probably just above freezing. Then we'll get divers equipped for cold water," she countered. "Sergeant, every one of those missing people, their trails ended in the woods around this quarry. If they're not still alive out there, then they might be in here." I didn't like it. The idea of disturbing that dark water made my skin crawl. It felt wrong somehow, like we would be waking something that should be left asleep. But she was right. We needed to search the quarry. The dive team arrived 2 days later. They were professionals from the Massachusetts State Police Marine Unit, experienced in cold water recovery operations. I stood on the edge of the quarry with Agent Wright and half a dozen other officers as the divers prepared their equipment. Maximum depth in this quarry is approximately 120 feet. The dive supervisor briefed his team. Visibility is going to be essentially 0 below 50 feet. Water temperature is 34 degrees. We'll work in shifts no more than 30 minutes per dive. The first 2 divers entered the water just after noon. I watched them disappear beneath the black surface, their lights quickly fading from view until they were just faint glows in the deep. The rest of us waited in tense silence, listening to the radio chatter between the divers and their supervisor on shore. Passing 60 feet, the radio crackled. "Visibility is near 0. We're using hand lines and searching by touch. More waiting. The wind picked up, making small ripples across the water's surface. 70 feet. We got debris down here. Looks like old quarrying equipment. Granite blocks. I found myself holding my breath, though I couldn't have said why. 80 feet. The voice came back, tense. We found something. It's metal, large, moving in for a closer look. The radio crackle was static for a moment, a sound that made my heart skip a beat. Then one of the divers came back on, his voice sounding strained. "Supervisor, we found the bus." A murmur went through the gathered officers. After 54 years, they had finally located the school bus. "What's the condition?" the supervisor asked. "It's upright," the diver reported, sitting on a ledge at about 85 feet. The whole front end is crushed, but the rest of the structure is intact. "We're going to need to go inside." "Negative," the supervisor said immediately. "That structure could be unstable. I don't want you penetrating the wreck on this dive. Mark the location, and we'll plan a proper recovery operation." "Understood," the diver replied. "But, supervisor, there's something else. The bus isn't alone down here. We've got other vehicles. At least 3 or 4. They're all around the bus, like they're arranged in a circle." Agent Wright and I exchanged looks, asked them to describe the vehicles. She said into the radio, "Dive team, can you identify the vehicles you're seeing?" "One looks like a pickup truck, relatively modern," came the reply. "Another is definitely a passenger car. Can't tell the make. They're all in a circle around the bus, maybe 15 feet out from it. It's deliberate. Has to be. There's no way they all just happen to end up in this configuration. Are there bodies in the vehicles?" Wright asked. There was a long pause before the diver responded. "Negative. The vehicles appear to be empty, but the doors are all open. Every single vehicle down here has its doors open, like someone got out and swam away. Impossible. No one could survive in water that cold, especially at that depth. And how would vehicles have gotten into the quarry in the first place? The fence had been there for decades. The mystery had just plummeted 85 feet deep." "Come up," the supervisor ordered, his voice tight with a tension that mirrored my own. "We need to regroup and figure out what we're dealing with." The divers surfaced about 10 minutes later, breaking the black surface of the water with gasps that were audible even from shore. I could see the strain etched onto their faces as they climbed out of the freezing depths, their movements heavy and slow. Once they were out of their gear, shivering despite the thermal suits, the lead diver, a man named Sergeant Tom Perkins, pulled Agent Wright and me aside. He looked rattled, a rare state for a man who spent his life in the dark, cold places of the world. "There's something down there that doesn't make sense," he said quietly, keeping his voice low so the others wouldn't hear. "The bus I can understand. It crashed through the ice in 1971. It's been there ever since. But those other vehicles, they're modern. One of them is a Honda Accord. Looks like it's from the mid to late 80s. There's no way that car has been underwater for more than a few years. Could they have been dumped in the quarry?" I asked, grasping for a rational explanation, pushed in from the edge by someone trying to hide evidence. Perkins shook his head firmly. "Not unless someone brought in heavy equipment to do it. These vehicles are 85 feet down, sitting on a narrow ledge. If they had been pushed, they wouldn't have landed so neatly. They'd have hit the walls on the way down, tumbled, gotten torn apart. No, these vehicles were placed there deliberately and carefully. That's impossible." I said, the word feeling inadequate. "I know what I saw," Perkins insisted. "Those cars are arranged in a perfect circle around the bus. Someone or something put them there." Agent Wright looked out at the dark water, her expression unreadable. "We need to identify those vehicles," she said. "If we can match them to our missing persons cases, we'll know we're on the right track." "I'll go back down," Perkins said, though I could see the hesitation in his eyes. "I'll get the VINs." The second dive took place an hour later. Perkins went down with another diver, armed with waterproof cameras and equipment to document what they found. They were down for nearly 40 minutes, a long time in those temperatures. When they surfaced, Perkins immediately started writing down numbers on a waterproof slate. "For vehicles total," he said, handing the slate to Wright. "I got VINs for all of them, and I took photos, though I doubt they'll show much given the visibility." We ran the VINs through the system immediately. The results came back within minutes, confirming our worst fears. All 4 vehicles matched cars that had been reported missing along Route 3 between 1987 and 1991. The Honda Accord belonged to Sandra Whitmore. She had been missing for less than a week, and yet her car was already at the bottom of the quarry, 85 feet underwater, arranged in a ceremonial circle with 3 other vehicles around a school bus that had been there for 54 years. "This doesn't make any sense," I said, leaning against the side of the command van. "How is this physically possible? Even if someone had a crane, how could they do this without anyone seeing? And in less than a week?" Agent Wright was quiet for a long moment, studying the dive reports and the vehicle registrations. Finally, she looked up at me. "Sergeant Durant," she said, her voice serious, "do you believe in the supernatural?" I blinked, taken aback by the question. "What?" "It's a simple question. Do you believe there are things in this world that can't be explained by science or logic?" I thought about the radio in Patricia Morrison's car, still playing after 4 years with a dead battery. I thought about the voice I'd heard coming through the static. I thought about the footprints in the snow that just ended with no sign of where the people had gone. "I believe there are things I can't explain," I said carefully, "but I don't jump to supernatural conclusions." "Neither do I," Wright said, "but I've been with the FBI for 15 years, and I've seen some cases that defied every rational explanation, things that made me question what I thought I knew about the world." "And you think this is one of those cases?" I asked. She looked back at the quarry, at the dark water that held so many secrets. 4 cars at the bottom of the flooded quarry, arranged in a circle around a bus full of dead children. Cars that got there by means we can't explain, on dates connected to the anniversary of a tragedy. People walking into the woods and vanishing without a trace. Radio frequencies that shouldn't work, but do. Yes, Sergeant Durant, I think this is one of those cases. That night, Agent Wright's team set up surveillance equipment around the quarry and in the woods near mile marker 42. Cameras, motion sensors, audio recording equipment. If something was moving in those woods, we would capture it. I went home around midnight, exhausted but too wound up to sleep. Karen was still awake, reading in bed. "You're going to make yourself sick," she said, putting her book down. "You've barely slept in 3 days." "We found the school bus," I told her, "and 4 cars arranged in a circle around it." She sat up, her eyes wide. "How did they get there?" "That's the question," I said, pacing the room. "Sandra Whitmore disappeared less than a week ago. Her car is at the bottom of the quarry. There's no way someone could have gotten it down there in that time, without us noticing. The quarry is under surveillance now. Has been since we started the investigation. Maybe the car was down there longer than you think," Karen suggested. "Maybe she disappeared before last week. Her husband reported her missing the day we found her car on the highway." I countered. "She was seen that morning leaving their house." "Karen, she vanished on Valentine's Day, and her car ended up at the bottom of the quarry where a school bus crashed on Valentine's Day 54 years ago." Karen was quiet for a moment. "The children," she said finally, "the 3 who were never recovered. Do you think they're still down there?" "They must be," I said. "The bus has been underwater for over 50 years. But I don't know what that has to do with people disappearing now." My phone rang, shattering the quiet of the bedroom. I looked at the caller ID and saw it was Agent Wright. "We've got something," she said without preamble. "One of the motion sensors in the woods triggered. There's someone out there." I was in my car 5 minutes later, racing toward Rockland with my lights and siren cutting through the night. When I arrived at the staging area near mile marker 42, I found Agent Wright and 3 other agents gearing up. The motion sensor was triggered about 20 minutes ago, she said, handing me a radio. We got a thermal camera showing a single person moving through the woods toward the quarry. They're moving slowly, deliberately, like they know exactly where they're going. Could it be one of the missing women? I asked. Maybe, she said, or it could be whoever, or whatever, has been luring them out there. We moved into the woods as a team, using night vision goggles to navigate the darkness, following the GPS coordinates from the motion sensor. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and our breath came out in white clouds that hung in the air. The woods were silent, except for the crunch of our footsteps in the frozen snow. We found the person near the edge of the quarry. It was a woman, standing at the very edge of the granite cliff, looking down at the black water below. She was wearing only a thin nightgown, no coat, no shoes. She should have been dead from hypothermia, but she was standing perfectly still, seemingly unaware of the cold. "Ma'am," Agent Wright called out softly. "Can you hear me?" The woman didn't react. She just stood there, staring at the water. We approached carefully. As we got closer, I could see her face in the moonlight. It was Rebecca Torres, the woman who had disappeared 2 days ago. Her skin was pale, almost blue, and her lips were tinged with purple, but her eyes were open, staring down at the quarry with an expression of absolute concentration. "Rebecca," I said, moving to within a few feet of her. "Rebecca Torres, can you hear me?" Still no response. I reached out slowly and touched her arm. Her skin was ice cold, colder than it should have been, even given the temperature and her lack of clothing. It was like touching a corpse. Suddenly, she spoke. Her voice was flat, monotone, utterly devoid of emotion. "They're waiting." "Who's waiting?" Agent Wright asked. "The children," Rebecca said. "They're still waiting. Still cold. Still afraid." "Rebecca, we need to get you somewhere warm. You're hypothermic. Come with us." But Rebecca shook her head slowly. "They need to be complete. 17 went down. Only 14 came up. 3 are still waiting. Still cold. Still afraid." She took a step toward the edge of the cliff. I grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Rebecca, stop." She turned to look at me for the first time, and what I saw her eyes made me let go and stumble backward. Her eyes were wrong. They were the same shape and color they'd always been. But there was something ancient behind them, something that had been in the cold and dark for a very long time. "They need to be complete," she said again. Then she smiled, an expression that didn't reach her eyes. 17 went down. And then she went limp, collapsing into Agent Wright's arms like a puppet with its strings cut. We carried Rebecca Torres back through the woods, her slight frame almost weightless in the arms of the agents. The journey to the waiting ambulance was tense, the silence of the forest broken only by the crunch of boots on snow and the labored breathing of the team. The paramedics were waiting at the trailhead, their vehicle a beacon of warmth and light in the encroaching darkness. As they worked on her, their faces betrayed their shock. They reported her core temperature was 86 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, most human beings would be unconscious, their bodies shutting down in a final, desperate attempt to preserve heat. Yet, Rebecca had been standing at the edge of that cliff, perfectly alert, speaking in full sentences until the moment she collapsed. It was a medical anomaly, one that defied the known limits of human physiology. She was rushed to South Shore Hospital in critical condition, the sirens wailing a mournful song into the night. The doctors later told us it was a miracle she was alive at all, but the victory was hollow. She wasn't talking anymore. She had slipped into a deep coma, a silence from which the doctors were not sure she would ever wake. The following morning, the atmosphere in the command post at the Rockland police station was heavy. The air smelled of stale coffee and anxiety. Agent Wright called a meeting of all the investigators. We gathered around a large table, looking at maps and reports, trying to make sense of the impossible puzzle we had found. 17 went down, Wright said, writing the number on the whiteboard in stark black marker. That is what Rebecca Torres said. 17 children died in the bus accident. She turned to face us. We have recovered 4 modern vehicles from the quarries so far. We have 2 more missing women whose vehicles we found on the highway, but whose bodies we haven't located. That makes 6 possible victims in the last week alone. Lieutenant Morrison leaned forward, his face etched with fatigue. What if it's not just the last week? He asked quietly. What if this has been happening every year, every February, for the last 20 years? Wright nodded and pulled up the historical data we had compiled the previous night. Looking at missing persons reports and abandoned vehicles on Route 3 near mile marker 42, we have confirmed cases going back to 1972, exactly 1 year after the bus accident. On average, 2 to 3 people go missing each year in the week leading up to February 14th. Most cases go cold with no leads. The files are thin, just dead ends and unanswered questions. I did the mental math, and the result made my stomach turn. 2 to 3 people per year for 20 years. That's 40 to 60 people at minimum, Wright confirmed, seeing the look on my face. And that is just the ones that were reported. There could be more. Drifters, people without families, those who wouldn't be missed immediately. The room fell silent. We were not looking at a crime spree. We were looking at a generation of loss, a silent tragedy that had been unfolding in our own backyard for decades. So, what is the connection? Asked one of the other agents, a young man who looked pale. Why does this keep happening? What is causing it? Wright turned back to the map of the quarry on the wall. Rebecca Torres said the children were waiting, that they were still cold and afraid. She said, 3 are still down there. She looked at me. Sergeant Durant, when they recovered the bodies from the bus in 1971, how extensive was the search? I pulled out the old accident report. The paper yellowed and brittle with age. They had divers in the water for 2 weeks. They recovered 14 bodies. The search was called off when the weather got too bad and the water temperature dropped to dangerous levels. It says here that the 3 missing children were believed to have been swept out of the bus by the current and carried downstream when the Weir River flooded that spring. But the Weir River doesn't flow through the quarry, Wright said, tapping the map. It's 50 yards away. If the bodies had been swept out of the bus by a current, they would have ended up in the quarry drainage tunnel, not in the river. Morrison looked up sharply. Are you saying the 3 children are still in the quarry? I'm saying it is a possibility, Wright replied. And if we're dealing with something unexplained, something that is driven by a need for completion, then those 3 missing children might be the key. The theory was terrifying in its simplicity. The spirits of the lost children, trapped in the cold dark, were trying to fill the empty seats on the bus. They were trying to make the number 17 whole again. But they couldn't distinguish between the past and the present, between a child and an adult. They were just taking people one by one, year after year, in a desperate, tragic attempt to be found. The realization hung in a room like a physical weight. We were no longer hunting a criminal in the traditional sense. We were dealing with a cycle of grief that had transcended death. If your theory is correct, I said slowly, trying to wrap my mind around the logic of the supernatural, then they have been taking people for 20 years, but it never stops. Why? Wright looked at the whiteboard, at the list of names and dates. Because it doesn't work, she said softly. They are taking replacements. But you can't replace a specific soul. They need the original 3. They need to be found. They need to be brought home. The drainage tunnel, I said, remembering the layout of the old quarry system. If they were swept out of the bus, that is the only place they could have gone. The tunnel connects the main quarry pit to the overflow basin. It's narrow, dangerous, and it hasn't been inspected since the mine closed in the 60s. Wright nodded. Then that is where we need to look. We organized a second dive operation immediately. This time, the mission was specific. We weren't just looking for vehicles. We were looking for the remains of 3 children. Jennifer Murphy, age 9, Thomas Carter, age 10, and the adult chaperone who had been with them, a woman named Rhea Bailey. The dive team was briefed on the new objective. Sergeant Perkins looked grim, but determined. "The drainage tunnel is at a depth of 90 feet, he said, studying the old blueprints. "It's about 4 feet wide. Tight squeeze. We'll have to go in single file. If there's debris blocking it, we might not be able to get through." The preparation took hours. We had to ensure the safety of the divers above all else. The mood by the quarry was somber. The wind had died down, leaving the water perfectly still, a black mirror reflecting the gray sky. It felt as if the quarry itself was waiting, holding its breath to see if we would finally uncover its secret. The divers entered the water at 2 p.m. We monitored their progress over the radio, the tension ratcheting up with every foot of depth they descended. "Approaching the bus," Perkins reported. "Visibility is slightly better today, maybe 3 feet. We waited, passing the bus, heading for the south wall. I can see the tunnel entrance. It's partially blocked by silt and rocks." "Can you enter?" Wright asked into the microphone. "Affirmative. I can squeeze through." "Going in." The radio went silent for a long, agonizing minute. The signal struggled to penetrate the rock and water. Then a burst of static, followed by Perkins' voice, breathless and distorted. "I'm in." The tunnel opens up into a small chamber about 20 feet in. It's a natural cavern. "What do you see?" I asked, leaning close to the speaker. I see them," Perkins said, his voice trembling. "I found them. 2 children. They're just lying here on a ledge. Preserved. The cold water. They look like they're sleeping." A collective sigh went through the group on shore. Jennifer Murphy and Thomas Carter. "Found at last. Is there anyone else?" Wright asked, "Is Rhea Bailey there?" "Negative," Perkins said. "Just the 2 kids. But there's something else." "What is it?" "There are marks on the walls," Perkins said. "Scratches, like someone was counting." The recovery of the 2 children was a delicate, heartbreaking operation. Seeing the small body bags being brought to the surface was a stark reminder of the tragedy that had started all of this. But the count was still wrong. 17 went down. 14 came up in 1971. 2 just came up now. That made 16. 1 was still missing. Rhea Bailey, the chaperone, the adult who had been responsible for them. Why isn't she with them? I asked right as the sun began to set. If she was swept into the tunnel with them, she should be there. "Unless she wasn't swept in," Wright said, her eyes scanning the quarry walls. "Unless she went somewhere else. Or unless she is the one keeping them there." We needed to find Rhea Bailey. She was the final piece of the puzzle, the one missing soul that kept the circle broken. I decided to look into the history of the Bailey family. I drove to the local library, digging through archives of newspapers from 1971. I found the obituary for the victims. There was a mention of Rhea's younger brother, Richard Bailey, who had been 18 at the time of the accident. He was listed as her only surviving relative. I found an address for a Richard Bailey still living in Rockland, in a small house not far from the quarry. I drove there as the twilight deepened. The house was old, weathered, with drawn curtains. I knocked on the door, and after a long moment, it opened. An older man stood there, his face lined with grief and time. "Richard Bailey?" I asked. He looked at my uniform, then passed me toward the woods. "You found them, didn't you?" he said, his voice raspy. "I heard the sirens. You found the children." "We found 2 of them," I said, "Jennifer and Thomas. But we haven't found your sister. We haven't found Rhea." Richard Bailey didn't look surprised. He stepped back and motioned for me to come inside. The house was cluttered, filled with stacks of old papers and books. But what caught my eye was a wall in the living room. It was covered in drawings, maps of the quarry, sketches of the woods, and tally marks. Hundreds of them, groups of 5, scratched into the wallpaper. "I've been watching," he said. "Seeing my gaze? For 50 years, I've been watching." I knew she was calling them. "You knew?" I asked, stunned. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Who would believe me?" he asked sadly. "She was always so responsible. My sister. She loved those kids. When the bus went down, I think she couldn't leave them. She stayed to take care of them. But it's cold down there, and she got lonely. She's been taking people," I said, "to keep them company." "She doesn't mean to hurt them," Richard said, tears running down his face. "She just wants to bring them home. She thinks if she gathers enough people, someone will finally notice. Someone will finally come for them." "We have come for them, Richard," I said gently, "but we need to find her. Where is she?" Richard walked to a window and pointed toward the woods, toward the quarry. "She's not in the tunnel," he said. "She never liked tight spaces. She's in the bus. She never left the bus. She's been sitting in the driver's seat for 54 years, waiting for the route to end." "The divers searched the bus," I said. "They said it was empty." "They looked in the back," Richard said, "where the kids were. They didn't look in the front. The front is crushed, buried in the silt. You have to dig for her." I radioed right immediately. "We need to go back down," I said. "We need to dig out the front of the bus." The final dive was scheduled for next morning. It was a dangerous request. Disturbing the silt could cause the bus to shift and crush the divers. But we had no choice. We had to finish the count. We had to bring the number to 17. The decision to excavate the front of the bus was met with a heavy silence among the team. We all understood the risk. The vehicle had been resting in that silt for over half a century, its structure compromised by the impact and the relentless pressure of the deep water. Disturbing the sediment around the crushed nose of the bus could destabilize the entire wreck, potentially causing it to slide off the ledge and plummet into the unknown depths of the quarry floor below. But the alternative, leaving Rhea Bailey down there, leaving the circle incomplete, was something none of us could accept. We had come too far, peeled back too many layers of this tragedy, to stop now. The atmosphere of the quarry that morning was reverent, almost church-like. The sky was a flat, slate gray, and a light snow had begun to fall, dusting the shoulders of our coats as we stood by the water's edge. Sergeant Perkins and his team prepared with a meticulous slowness. They were checking and rechecking their gear, their movements deliberate and focused. They were carrying dredging equipment this time. Heavy hoses designed to suck away the mud and debris that had entombed the front of the bus. "We'll work in shifts of 15 minutes, Perkins told us, his voice calm but serious. "Any sign of movement from the bus, any groan of metal, we pull out immediately. No heroes today." I watched as they slipped beneath the surface, the black water swallowing them whole. The only connection we had to them was the thin umbilical of the radio and the bubbles breaking the surface. On site, Perkins reported after what felt like an eternity. "Visibility is poor. The silt is thick here, setting up the dredge." The sound of the pump starting up vibrated through the ground beneath our feet, a low hum that resonated in my chest. We waited, listening to the static and occasional updates. Clearing the driver's side window, glass is gone, the frame is twisted. Minutes ticked by. I looked at Richard Bailey, who was standing a little apart from the group, his eyes fixed on the water. He looked like a statue, frozen in a vigil he had kept for most of his life. He was waiting for his sister to come home. "I see something." The radio crackled. It's fabric. A coat. Blue wool. Richard let out a small, sharp breath. "She was wearing a blue coat," he whispered. "It was new. She was so proud of it." Moving more silt, Perkins said, "Careful, careful. Okay, I have visual confirmation. We found her." A wave of emotion washed over me, a mix of relief and profound sadness. After 54 years in the dark, Rhea Bailey had been found. She had been sitting there the whole time, just as her brother had said, waiting at the wheel of her bus, watching over her charges in the only way she could. The recovery process was slow and respectful. The divers worked gently to free her remains from the wreckage, treating her with the dignity she deserved. When they finally brought her to the surface, the snow had started to fall harder, covering the world in a soft, white blanket. The team lifted the body bag onto the shore with a solemn grace. Richard Bailey stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the heavy vinyl of the bag. He didn't say a word, but the look on his face, of pain finally given a place to rest, was something I would never forget. The circle was closed. 17 went down. 17 had finally come up, but the work wasn't quite done. As the divers were packing up their gear, Perkins walked over to Agent Wright and me. He looked shaken, his face pale even for the cold. "There's something else," he said quietly. When we cleared the silt inside the bus on the dashboard, he reached into his pouch and pulled out a small, waterlogged object. It was a plastic lunchbox, faded but still intact. It was sitting right next to her, he said, and behind her seat there were toys, dolls, trucks, little things. They weren't from 1971. They were new. Some of them looked like they were from the 80s. I took the lunchbox, my hands numb. I opened it carefully. Inside, sealed in a plastic bag that had somehow kept the water out, was a note. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded but legible. It was written in a child's hand, for the lady on the bus, so she won't be lonely. I looked at Wright, the missing people. I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. They didn't just disappear. They were bringing things. They were bringing gifts. The people who had walked into the woods, the ones who had vanished without a trace, they hadn't been taken by force. They had been compelled, drawn by a sense of overwhelming empathy, to bring comfort to the lonely soul in the water. They had walked into the quarry not in fear, but in an act of impossible kindness, guided by the spirit of a woman who just wanted her children to be happy. The discovery of the toys changed everything. It reframed the horror of the last 20 years into a tragedy of connection. The haunting wasn't a malicious force preying on the living. It was a cry for help that had been answered in the only way the spirits knew how. The people who had died, Patricia Morrison, the owner of the green Buick, Margaret Higgle, and the others, they had become part of the spectral community, drawn together to care for the lost children. They were the replacements not for the children, but for the parents who could never come. We spent the rest of the day processing the scene. The toys were cataloged, each one a heartbreaking piece of evidence linking a missing person to the underwater shrine. I sat with Richard Bailey in his living room that evening. The house felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from its foundations. He told me about the tally marks on the wall. Every year, he said, tracing the lines with a weathered finger. Every year around Valentine's Day, I'd feel it. A pull, a sadness, so deep it felt like drowning. I knew she was waking up. I knew she was remembering. You kept count, I said. You were the only one who remembered. Someone had to, he said, simply. They were forgotten, Sergeant. The world moved on. The quarry was fenced off. The accident became a story people told to scare their kids. But they were still down there. My sister, those babies, they were still waiting. He looked at me, his eyes clear for the first time. Thank you, he said, for listening, for going down there. We just did our job, I said, though it felt like far more than that. Richard, the people who joined them, do you think they're at peace now? He looked out the window toward the dark woods. I think they were never at war, he said softly. I think they were just helping in a way we can't understand. But now that Rhea is home, now that the children are found, I think the waiting is over. We organized a memorial service for the following week. It was to be a joint service, honoring the 3 victims from 1971 and the missing persons we had recovered from the quarry. We contacted the families of the missing, Sandra Whitmore's husband, Patricia Morrison's sister, the relatives of the others. It was a difficult series of conversations, reopening old wounds, but offering, finally, a sense of closure. We also had to deal with the practicalities of the impossible vehicles. The FBI, under Agent Wright's direction, classified the case files. The official report would state that the vehicles were found in the quarry, likely dumped there over the years, and that the missing persons have been victims of drowning accidents. The supernatural elements, the radio, the voice, the arrangement of the cars, would be omitted. The world isn't ready for this, Wright told me as we finalized the paperwork. They need answers they can understand. They need to know their loved ones are found, not that they were part of a ghostly summoning. I agreed. The truth was too heavy, too strange to be public record. It belonged to the woods, to the water, and to Richard Bailey. But there was one loose end. Rebecca Torres. She was still in the hospital, still in a coma. The doctor said her condition was stable but unchanged. She was the only survivor, the one who had stood at the edge and looked into the abyss without falling in. I went to visit her the day before the memorial. Her room was quiet, filled with the rhythmic beeping of monitors. Her husband was sitting by her bedside, holding her hand. He looked up as I entered, his face haggard. Any change? I asked softly. He shook his head. She's just sleeping. The doctors say her brain activity is normal. They don't know why she won't wake up. I walked over to bed and looked down at Rebecca. She looked peaceful, her face relaxed. I thought about what she had said in the woods. 17 went down. Only 14 came up. She had been the vessel for that message. She had been the bridge between the living and the dead. Rebecca, I whispered, leaning close. It's done. We found them. We found Rhea. We found the children. The count is complete. You can come back now. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the rhythm of the heart monitor sped up slightly. Her eyelids fluttered. Her husband gasped. Standing up, "Becky," he called out. "Becky, can you hear me?" Slowly, agonizingly, her eyes opened. They were foggy at first, unfocused. But then they found her husband's face. She blinked, and a tear rolled down her cheek. "They're warm," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "What?" her husband asked, leaning in. "What did you say?" "The children," she said, her voice stronger. "They're warm now. They went home." I stepped back, feeling a lump in my throat. She was back. The connection had been severed. The haunting of Route 3 was over. I left the room quietly, leaving them to their reunion. I walked out of the hospital into the bright, cold winter sunlight. The world looked different. The snow was just snow. The trees were just trees. The ominous weight that had hung over the town for weeks was gone, lifted like a fog burning off in the morning sun. But I knew I would never look at a frozen lake or a dark forest in the same way again. I knew now that the line between the living and the dead was thinner than we dared to imagine, and that sometimes love and duty could bridge even that impossible divide. The recovery of Rhea Bailey and the children had brought a sense of resolution to the surface, but the deeper mysteries of the quarry still lingered in the back of my mind. The discovery of the toys and the note in the lunchbox had shifted our understanding, painting a picture of sorrow rather than malice. But there were still physical questions that demanded answers. Specifically, the layout of the underwater world where these souls had resided for so long. We needed to be certain that no one else was left behind. The decision to explore the drainage tunnel further was not made lightly. It was a place of shadows and narrow passages, a relic of the quarry's industrial past that had been swallowed by the rising waters. Sergeant Perkins was the one to volunteer for the final push into the tunnel. "We need to map it," he said during the briefing, his voice steady. "If the children were found in the antechamber, we need to know what lies beyond. The currents that have carried evidence, or others, deeper into the system." The tunnel entrance, located at a depth of 90 feet, was a formidable gateway. It was a jagged mouth in a rock face, partially obscured by decades of silt and aquatic growth. The plan was for a two-man team to enter, tethered to the surface and to each other, to document the full extent of the subterranean passage. I watched from the command tent as the monitors flickered to life, showing the grainy, green-tinted view from Perkins' helmet camera. The water in the tunnel was clearer than in the main quarry, undisturbed by the currents and the weather above. The walls were rough-hewn granite, marked by the drill holes of miners who had worked the stone nearly a century ago. As Perkins moved forward, his light played across the surfaces, revealing the scars of the past. Entering the main corridor, his voice crackled over the speaker. Width is narrowing. It's about 3 feet here. Ceiling height is stable at 6 feet. The claustrophobia of the environment was palpable even through the screen. I could hear the rhythmic breathing of the divers, the sound amplified by the water and the technology. They moved slowly, respectfully, as if entering a cathedral. About 50 feet into the tunnel, the passage opened up unexpectedly. "I'm entering a larger chamber," Perkins reported. "It looks like a natural fault that was widened by the mining operations. It's vast." He swept his light around, and the beam failed to hit the far walls. The chamber was immense, a hidden world beneath the earth. But it was what lay in the center of the chamber that made us all catch our breath. The floor of the cavern was covered in fine, white sand, starkly different from the dark silt of the quarry. And resting on that sand, arranged with meticulous care, were objects, not just random debris, but a collection. There were rows of what looked like old mining tools, rusted but orderly. There were tires, pieces of metal, and more personal items, shoes, bottles, things that had drifted down or been brought here. "It's a shrine," Agent Wright whispered, standing beside me. "Or a garden." In the center of this underwater garden, the divers found the final resting place of the chaperones. The 6 recent bodies we had recovered earlier, Sandra Whitmore, Patricia Morrison, and the others, had been found in the main quarry near the bus. But here, in this secluded chamber, were the remains of others. Older remains, bones that had been polished by the water and time, laid out in a circle. These must be the ones from the 70s and 80s, Perkins said, his voice hushed. The ones who were never reported. The drifters. The lost. They weren't discarded. They were placed together. It was a community of the lost, gathered in the quiet dark, keeping each other company in the absence of sun. We counted 12 sets of remains in that chamber. 12 people who had vanished over the last 20 years without a trace, now found in a place of silent dignity. It was a sobering discovery. The scale of the haunting was larger than we had imagined, but its nature was gentle. These people hadn't been trapped. They had been collected. They were part of family forged in tragedy. "We need to bring them up," I said, though the thought of disturbing this peace felt almost like a violation. They deserve names. They deserve to go home. The recovery of the 12 souls from the inner chamber took 3 days. It was a solemn procession of divers surfacing with their precious cargo, the mood on the shore shifting from investigation to memorial. We set up a temporary morgue to handle the remains, treating each individual with the utmost care. Forensic anthropologists were brought in to help with identification, using dental records and DNA where possible to give names to the bones. It was slow, painstaking work, but it was necessary. Each name recovered was a mystery solved, a family notified, a question answered after years of silence. On the final night of the operation, after the last of the remains had been cleared from the tunnel, something extraordinary happened. The thermal cameras we had set up around the quarry perimeter, the ones that had first spotted Rebecca Torres, were still running. It was just after midnight, the witching hour when the world feels thinnest. I was in the command van with the technician, reviewing the day's footage, when the monitors flared white. "What was that?" I asked, leaning in. "Glitch?" the technician suggested, tapping the keyboard. "No, look." It sustained. On the screen, the surface of the quarry water was glowing. It wasn't a reflection of the moon or our work lights. It was coming from below, a soft, pulsing luminescence that seemed to radiate from the depths. We ran outside, joined by Agent Wright and the few remaining officers. We stood at the edge of the fence and looked down. The water, usually so black and impenetrable, was lit within by a pale, blue light. It swirled and danced, forming shapes that moved with fluid grace. "It's heat," the technician called out from the van. "The thermal sensors are reading a massive spike in temperature. The water is warming up." "How?" Wright asked. "There's no geothermal activity here." I watched the light, mesmerizing and beautiful. It didn't look like fire. It looked like energy, like life. As we watched, the light began to coalesce. It formed 17 distinct points of brilliance, arranging themselves in a circle on the surface of the water. They bobbed gently, like lanterns on a pond. Then, slowly, they began to fade. One by one, the lights dimmed and vanished, as if they were stepping through a door we couldn't see. "The children," I whispered, "and the adults, they're leaving." The warmth in the air was palpable. A sudden thaw in the deep winter freeze. The ice that had begun to form at the edges of the quarry cracked and melted. For a few minutes, it felt like spring. Then, the last light winked out, and the quarry returned to darkness. But it was a different kind of darkness. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive gloom that had hung over the place for weeks. It was just the natural, quiet dark of a sleeping world. The presence was gone. The waiting was over. The next morning, the water temperature in the quarry was measured at 45 degrees, 10 degrees warmer than it had been the day before. There was no scientific explanation for it. The sensors showed no geological changes, no chemical reactions. It was simply as if the cold heart of the place had started to beat again. We packed up the site that day. The fence was repaired, stronger this time, but it felt less like a barrier to keep people out and more like a marker of a sacred space. We left the flowers that people had started to leave at the gate. Bouquets of roses, carnations, and baby's breath, bright splashes of color against the gray stone. I drove Richard Bailey to the site one last time before we closed the investigation. He stood at the gate, looking through the new mesh. He looked lighter, younger. The burden of 50 years of watching had been lifted from his shoulders. "They're gone, aren't they?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "They moved on." He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Good. It was time. It was a long winter, Sergeant. A very long winter. What will you do now?" I asked him. He turned away from the quarry, looking back toward the town. "I think I'll sleep," he said. "For the first time in a long time, I think I'll just sleep." We walked back to the car together, leaving the quarry behind us. The story of Route 3 would fade into local legend, a tale told in hushed tones about the haunted woods and the ghost bus. But for those of us who were there, who saw the lights and felt the change, it would always be a story about love, about a bond so strong it defied death, and a community of souls that found each other in the dark. It was a reminder that even in the coldest places, warmth can be found, and that no one is ever truly lost as long as someone remembers them. The days leading up to February 20th were filled with a quiet, somber activity that transformed the town of Rockland. What had begun as a criminal investigation had evolved into a community-wide act of remembrance. The story of the missing, both the children from 1971 and the adults who had vanished in the decades since, had touched a nerve, awakening a collective empathy that transcended the usual boundaries of strangers. A joint memorial service was organized to be held at the Holy Family Church, a grand old building whose stone walls had witnessed generations of joy and sorrow. It was decided that this would not just be a funeral for the recently recovered. It would be a ceremony to honor the entire history of the tragedy, a way to close a wound that had festered in silence for 50 years. The morning of the service dawned with a clear, brilliant sky. The sun reflected off the snow-covered ground, creating a world of blinding white light that felt cleansing, hopeful. I arrived early, dressed in my dress uniform, the polished buttons and badge gleaming in the sunlight. The church was already filling up. Families of the missing, many of whom had traveled from across the state, sat in the front pews. I saw Sandra Whitmore's husband, looking tired but composed, holding the hand of his young daughter. I saw the sister Patricia Morrison weeping softly into a handkerchief, and in the front row, sitting with a quiet dignity that commanded respect, was Richard Bailey. He wore a dark suit that looked a little too large for him, perhaps an old one he had saved for a special occasion. The service was beautiful. The priest spoke of memory, of the enduring power of love, and of the peace that comes with finding one's way home. He didn't speak of ghosts or hauntings. He spoke of the long journey and the waiting. He acknowledged the pain of the families who had lived with uncertainty for so long, and he celebrated the relief of finally having answers as he read the names of the deceased, starting with the 17 children and their chaperone, Rhea Bailey, and continuing through the list of the adults we had recovered from the quarry. A bell was tolled for each soul. The sound reverberated through the church, a deep, resonant note that seemed to vibrate in the chest. 33 times the bell rang. 33 lives acknowledged, honored, and released. When the service concluded, we moved to the cemetery for the interment. A special section had been set aside for the victims of the quarry tragedy. A beautiful plot of land shaded by ancient oak trees. The coffins were lowered into the ground side by side, reuniting the children with their families and the lost adults with the earth. It was there, standing by the open grave of his sister, that Richard Bailey spoke. He didn't have prepared notes. He simply stood by the edge of the grave, placed his hand on the polished wood of the casket, and looked out at the gathered crowd. She never wanted to be alone, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. And she never wanted anyone else to be alone, either. That was her gift and her burden. She stayed because she loved. And you, he looked at the families of the other victims. Your loved ones stayed because they loved, too. They weren't taken. They gave themselves to keep the children warm. They were heroes of the heart. He looked down at the grave one last time. You can go home now, Rhea, he whispered. The bus is empty. The route is finished. You can go home. That night, back at the quarry, the final piece of the release occurred. The surveillance equipment, which was scheduled to be dismantled the next day, captured one last anomaly. It wasn't a spike in temperature or a visual manifestation. It was sound. The audio recorders, which had picked up nothing but wind and silence since the lights had vanished, suddenly registered a noise. It was faint, distant, like a memory of a sound. It was the sound of children laughing. Not the eerie, distorted laughter of a horror story, but the genuine, bright sound of play. It lasted for only a few seconds, drifting over the water like a mist, and then it faded into the wind. The technicians who heard it said it was the most peaceful sound they had ever heard. The haunting was truly over. The energy that had bound the place to the past had dissipated, leaving only the natural quiet of the woods. 3 years have passed since the events at the quarry. Life in Rockland has returned to its normal rhythm. The seasons turn, the snow falls and melts, and the trees in the woods near Route 3 grow taller. I retired from the force a year after the investigation closed. The things I saw, the truths I learned about the thin veil between worlds, changed me in ways I couldn't articulate in a police report. I couldn't go back to writing speeding tickets or investigating burglaries. The mundane problems of the world seemed small, distant, compared to the vast, silent reality I touched. I spent my time working in my garden, reading, and trying to be present with Karen, who had been my anchor through the storm. But the silence didn't last. It never does for those who have listened to it for too long. I still kept the old radio from Patricia Morrison's car. I had taken it from evidence before the car was crushed, a memento I couldn't explain why I needed. It sat on a shelf in my garage, a dead piece of machinery, gathering dust. Sometimes, late at night, I would go out there and turn the dial, just to hear the static, just to see if the amber light would flicker to life. It never did. It was just a broken radio. Until last Tuesday, I was in the garage, sorting through some boxes, when I heard it. A faint hum. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I turned to look at the shelf. The radio was dark, but the sound was coming from it, a low, rhythmic static. In and out, in and out. I walked over to it, my heart hammering a familiar, terrified rhythm against my ribs. I reached out and turned the volume knob. The static cleared instantly, replaced by a melody. It was a simple tune, a children's song, hummed by a woman's voice. It was soothing, gentle, but it carried an undercurrent of profound sadness. I listened for a minute, paralyzed, until the song faded and the radio went dead again. The next morning, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was from Vermont. I answered it, already knowing who it would be. Sergeant Durant? The voice was older, but the sharp intelligence was unmistakable. It's Caroline Wright. Agent Wright. I said, it's been a long time. It has, she said. I'm retired now, too, living up near Burlington. There was a pause. Mike, are you sitting down? I am, I said. What is it? There's been a development, she said. Up here, near Lake Champlain, we've had a series of disappearances. Hikers, boaters, people vanishing without a trace. That happens, I said, though my grip on the phone tightened. Wilderness areas are dangerous. It's the pattern, Mike, she said. They're disappearing near the site of an old ferry accident, a boat that sank in 1972. 19 people died. They never recovered all the bodies. I felt a cold chill spread through me, a familiar sensation that I hadn't felt in 3 years. And I asked, and last night, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, a local sheriff found a car abandoned near the lake. The driver was gone, but the radio was on, and it was playing a song, a children's song. I closed my eyes, leaning back against the kitchen counter. I thought about Richard Bailey, finally at peace. I thought about the lights rising from the quarry. I thought about the 12 lost souls who had given themselves to comfort the lonely dead. It wasn't just Route 3. It wasn't just one bus. The world was full of these places. Places where the tragedy was too great for the earth to swallow, where the grief was too heavy to fade. Places where the dead were still waiting, cold and afraid, for someone to come and find them. I'm packing a bag. I said, I'll be there by tonight. I thought you might say that. Wright said, I've got a guest room. And Mike, bring the file. The one we kept. The real one. I will, I said. I hung up the phone and looked out the window at my garden. The daffodils were just starting to poke through the soil, a promise of spring. I loved this peace. I loved my quiet life. But I knew I couldn't stay. I knew that somewhere in the dark water of a northern lake, there were voices calling out. And I knew, with a certainty that was both a burden and a calling, that I was one of the few people who could hear them. I went upstairs to tell Karen. She saw the bag on the bed and the look in my eyes, and she didn't ask why. She just nodded, a sad, understanding smile on her face. Be careful, she said. I will, I promise. I'm just going to help them. I walked out to the car, tossing the bag in the passenger seat. I took one last look at my house, at the life I had built, and then I turned the key. The engine roared to life, a comforting mechanical sound. I pulled out of the driveway and headed north, toward the highway, toward the cold, toward the waiting. I'm going to help them, even if it costs me everything, because the dead are calling, and God help us, the living answer.